A quiet confidence. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the sky as Maya Bennett stepped into the airport terminal. The early morning air was filled with the usual hum of activity, travelers rushing to catch flights, the rhythmic sound of rolling luggage across the shiny tiles, the crisp crackle of intercom announcements, and the hurried chatter of people navigating through the busy crowd. Yet, in the midst of it all, Maya stood still for a brief moment, taking it all in. She was accustomed to the buzz, to the ebb and flow of airport life. She had traveled this route countless times, though today felt different. Perhaps it was the anticipation of the flight, or maybe it was the sense of empowerment that had quietly grown within her in recent years. Today, she wasn't just a passenger on a plane. Today, she was a woman who had worked tirelessly to carve her own path in a world that often tried to remind her where she should belong. As she passed through security, she offered the agent a polite smile, though there was a faint recognition in his eyes, one that Maya had become all too familiar with. People didn't always look at her the same way they looked at others. She was a black woman, and there was an unspoken expectation for her to remain in certain spaces, places that others deemed appropriate. But Maya had learned to stand her ground, to refuse to let anyone define her worth. Today, that resolve was stronger than ever. Her father had told her that she earned her place in this world, that every step she took toward success was a result of her hard work and determination. "You've worked hard for this, baby girl. You deserve to be treated as such," he had said that morning before dropping her off at the airport. His words had stayed with her as she passed through the gates and toward the boarding area. Maya's father was a force to be reckoned with, a man whose name commanded respect in every boardroom, whose decisions shaped entire industries. She had been raised in a world that could be cold and distant, a world where success was often measured in numbers, in profit margins, in status. Her father had always encouraged her to aim high, to push for more, but to never forget where she came from. He had seen the world through a lens of resilience and ambition, and he had passed that same lens on to her. Maya's gaze drifted over the other passengers in the first-class boarding area as she took her place in line. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, some fleeting glances, some lingering stares. The subtle, judgmental glances that were too soft to be overt but heavy enough to make her feel out of place. She could sense their curiosity, their hesitation. They didn't know her, didn't know the hard work she had put in, or the sacrifices she had made to get here. They saw only the exterior. A black woman standing in first class, a space that many people still believed was reserved for a certain kind of person. She could hear the murmurs of people discussing the flight, the polite conversations about the latest news, the weather in their destinations. But it was as though Maya's presence was a quiet interruption to their calm. They didn't speak it aloud, but there it was, a subtle undercurrent of doubt. What was she doing here? She ignored them. She had learned long ago that she could not afford to be distracted by the opinions of others. If she did, she would be forever tethered to their perceptions, forever questioning whether she had the right to occupy spaces that were meant for others. Instead, she held her head high, her shoulders back, and walked with a sense of quiet confidence. Maya Bennett belonged here, and she didn't need anyone's approval to validate that truth. As she approached the boarding gate, her fingers brushed against the fabric of her suit, adjusting it with a subtle flick. Her appearance was sharp, composed, designed not to draw too much attention but to command respect. The slim cut of her jacket, the precision of her tailored pants, the understated elegance of her accessories, everything about her was a deliberate expression of who she was, confident, competent, and unyielding. Her father had taught her that true power wasn't about standing above others, it was about standing with them, with the quiet knowledge that you were just as deserving of your space in the world. She looked down at her boarding pass once more to confirm the seat number. First class. Row 1A. There was no mistake. She had earned her right to sit there just as much as anyone else. And yet, she knew what was coming. It was the same every time. The skepticism. The judgment. The disbelief that someone like her could hold a seat in the front of the plane. She had seen it happen before. Her place was always questioned, always scrutinized. But she didn't flinch. Not anymore. The line moved forward, and she slipped past the gate agent without a second thought. A polite nod, a brief smile, and she was on her way. As she made her way down the jet bridge, her thoughts turned briefly to the one person who had always believed in her without question, her father. He had never wavered in his support for her, had never made her feel anything less than worthy of the opportunities she had been given. She remembered the long nights she had spent with him at their family home, him poring over business strategies and life lessons, teaching her the importance of integrity, of knowing your worth, of never backing down when the world tried to tell you that you didn't belong. When she stepped onto the plane, her heart beat just a little faster. This was the moment. The culmination of years of hard work and ambition. She wasn't just a passenger. She was Maya Bennett, and she was about to show the world that she belonged, no matter what they thought. The first-class cabin was as luxurious as she had imagined it, wide, plush seats arranged with meticulous care. She looked around for a moment, the quiet hum of conversations filling the air, but she paid little attention to them. Her seat was near the front, the window seat she had requested. She passed rows of reclining seats, their occupants already settled in, some half-closed eyes scanning their phones, others flipping through magazines or chatting quietly. She slid into her seat with ease, adjusting the small leather bag she carried with her and folding her legs underneath the table as she buckled her seatbelt. The feeling of the seat beneath her was a familiar comfort, a tangible reminder that this was where she belonged. She didn't need anyone to validate that for her. But as she glanced around, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the other passengers were still on her. She could feel them, the subtle gaze of judgment, the silent question hanging in the air, what is she doing here? The challenge was never spoken out loud, but it was always there, hanging, heavy, unacknowledged. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, her nails pressing into the soft fabric. Maya fought the urge to let the anxiety creep in. She had come this far, worked too hard to let their doubt shake her resolve. She inhaled deeply, letting the quiet hum of the plane and the sound of the engines envelop her. This was her space now. And no one would take that from her. The flight attendant soon made her way down the aisle, but Maya was already prepared. She could feel the woman's gaze land on her as she approached, the brief flicker of recognition, of doubt. Maya didn't look up. She didn't need to. The flight attendant would find her seat, she would do her job, and the world would keep turning. The woman stopped in front of her. "Excuse me, is this your seat?" the flight attendant asked, her tone polite but with an edge of uncertainty. Maya didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply, her voice calm and unwavering. She glanced up at the woman briefly, making eye contact, but not enough to appear confrontational. "I have 1A." The flight attendant's eyes flicked to the ticket in her hand, then back to Maya. There was a pause, a slight hesitation, before the attendant nodded, perhaps realizing that the seating chart was correct. "Apologies," she said, her voice now distant, her manner professional. "Enjoy your flight." Maya simply nodded in return, not saying another word. The attendant moved on to the next passenger without further comment, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that still lingered in the air. This was the reality she faced, and it wasn't just about the seat. It was about the unspoken, invisible barriers that society had created for people like her. She wasn't just fighting for her place on this plane. She was fighting for her place in the world. The seat that was her right. The cabin of the plane hummed softly as it filled with passengers, each of them settling into their seats, preparing for the long journey ahead. Maya adjusted herself in her seat, feeling the plush leather conform to her body as she reclined just a little, allowing the calm of the moment to wash over her. She reached down to retrieve her phone from her bag and turned it off, closing her eyes for a brief second. For the first time that morning, she felt a semblance of peace, a quiet, fleeting moment where nothing seemed to matter beyond the rhythmic sound of the plane's engines. As the last few passengers boarded, she noticed the flight attendants moving through the aisles with practiced precision, securing overhead bins, offering warm smiles to the first-class passengers. Maya glanced briefly out of the window beside her, watching the ground below grow smaller as the plane taxied toward the runway. Despite the smooth, mechanical rhythm of the plane's preparation for takeoff, there was a strange unease fluttering in her chest, something that she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the flight itself, she had flown countless times before, but today felt different. It was as if the space she occupied, the very air she breathed, was under constant scrutiny. For all of her success, for all the accomplishments that had brought her to this point, Maya knew that being a black woman in spaces like this, luxury spaces, business spaces, often meant carrying an invisible weight. It wasn't just about the money or the access, it was about the assumptions that came with it. Assumptions that said she shouldn't be here. That she didn't belong. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But today, it felt heavier, more pronounced. She was snapped out of her thoughts when she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. A quick glance toward the front of the cabin told her that the flight attendants were nearing the final stages of their preparations. The door had been closed, and the captain had just come over the intercom, announcing the usual protocol before takeoff. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to slowly inch forward, gaining speed as it began its ascent into the sky. Maya settled back into her seat, drawing in a steady breath as the plane gained altitude. With every mile, the ground below became a distant memory, and the cabin around her filled with the soft murmur of passengers' conversations, a gentle lull that made it feel as though time had momentarily stopped. The hum of the engines became her soundtrack as she lost herself in the calm rhythm of the flight. But as much as she tried to let the stillness of the air envelope her, the uncomfortable feeling in her chest persisted, refusing to be ignored. It was the interaction with the flight attendant earlier, the judgment in her eyes, the slight hesitation in her voice. Maya could feel it like a shadow in the corner of her mind. The woman hadn't questioned her outright, but there was no mistaking the subtle doubt that lingered in the air. Maya had been through enough of these situations to recognize the signs, the way people looked at her, the moment of hesitation when they processed the fact that a black woman was sitting in first class. Maya was used to it. She had always been used to it. Her father, a wealthy businessman with a name that commanded respect in industries worldwide, had taught her how to navigate these spaces. He had drilled into her the importance of holding her head high, of never shrinking to make others feel comfortable. "You walk into a room like you own it, Maya," he would say with a smile that always carried a note of pride. "People will try to make you feel small, but you show them that you are just as big, just as worthy." Maya had taken those words to heart. They had guided her through many challenges in life. But today felt different. There was a palpable tension that hovered just beyond her reach, a reminder that in spaces like this, where wealth and status often speak louder than merit, she would always have to prove herself. The world might not see her as worthy of the same privileges afforded to others. But she had earned her place. She had done the work, fought the battles, and weathered the storms. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Still, the uncomfortable feeling remained. She let out a soft breath and glanced around the cabin, her eyes briefly meeting those of a few passengers who had been watching her. Their gazes quickly flickered away, almost too quickly. Maya smiled faintly to herself. They were uncomfortable. Uncertain. Unsure of what to make of her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black notebook, its cover embossed with a gold emblem of her own design. It was something she had created for herself, a brand, a mark of her hard work and personal success. The pages inside were filled with notes, sketches, and thoughts on the business ventures she had been juggling. Maya had made a name for herself in the world of tech and innovation, carving out her own path, separate from the shadow of her father's business empire. But the struggles that came with it were real. No one was ready to see her as just another successful entrepreneur. They still saw her as a black woman in a space where few looked like her. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks to the first-class passengers. Maya accepted a glass of sparkling water, nodding politely as the attendant moved on to the next seat. She couldn't help but notice the woman's stiff posture as she passed. The interaction had left a mark, an imprint that could not be erased. It was the kind of thing Maya had learned to live with over the years. The quiet discrimination, the unspoken assumptions that, no matter how much she achieved, she would never quite be able to escape. She thought back to her father's words, remembering how he had always insisted that she never let others define her. But it was hard. It was so hard when the world continued to hold up mirrors that only reflected half of who she was. Maya knew that her father would have a different perspective on what had happened. He would brush it off, perhaps even joke about it in his confident, self-assured way. "You belong everywhere, Maya. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But that wasn't always so simple, was it? The world didn't always operate that way, especially for people like her. Her thoughts were interrupted when a voice spoke from the aisle. "Is everything okay with your seat?" It was the flight attendant, the same one from earlier, who now approached her with a nervous smile. Her body language was tense, almost stiff, as if she was bracing for something. Maya didn't respond immediately. She had already answered this woman's questions, but there was something in her tone now, something different. "Yes," Maya replied, her voice cool, though there was a hint of something stronger beneath it. "Everything's fine." The flight attendant seemed to hesitate for a moment, glancing down at the seating chart she held in her hand. "I just wanted to make sure that you're comfortable, ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly laced with a kind of forced politeness. Maya gave her a small, polite smile, even though it felt forced on her part. Was this what the woman had come to apologize for? "I'm fine. Thank you," Maya said firmly, her gaze unwavering. She didn't want to engage in any further conversation, not with someone who had made her feel as if her presence here had been an inconvenience. The attendant nodded quickly and moved on, but Maya could feel the subtle shift in the cabin. The tension that had been in the air seemed to dissipate a little as the plane continued its ascent. The low murmur of conversations returned, but Maya kept her focus inward. She wasn't concerned with the subtle glares or the hushed conversations. She was here for one reason and one reason only, because she had earned it. Maya took another sip of her water, her fingers curling around the glass as she looked out the window. The clouds below appeared like cotton, soft and billowy. She let out a long, slow breath, the quiet stillness of the sky filling her with a sense of peace. This was her moment. No one could take that away from her. And as the flight progressed, she reminded herself of the simple truth she had carried with her all these years: no matter how many questions they asked, no matter how many glances they stole in her direction, she belonged. She had every right to be here. She didn't need to prove it to anyone. The journey wasn't just about getting to her destination. It was about the strength it took to hold her ground every step of the way. A quiet storm. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm, the occasional sound of laughter and quiet chatter drifting through the cabin as the passengers adjusted to the gentle hum of the aircraft in flight. Maya had long since turned her attention inward, using the time to catch up on work, reviewing some business proposals on her tablet. She wasn't one to sit idle, not with so much on her plate. The digital world moved quickly, and so did she. Every moment spent in the air was an opportunity to get ahead, even if just a little. The luxury of first-class amenities was a comfort, but it wasn't her focus. She had earned this place, but it wasn't the place itself that mattered. What mattered was the work, the long hours, the strategy, the connections, the relentless drive that had taken her where she was today. But despite her usual ability to shut out distractions, there was something gnawing at her, a subtle unease that refused to fade. She found herself repeatedly glancing up from her tablet, her eyes wandering over the rest of the cabin. The other passengers were easy enough to ignore at first, absorbed in their own worlds, some lost in their newspapers or books, others absorbed in conversation. But it wasn't their conversations or activities that held her attention. It was the look on the faces of the flight attendants, the way they moved about the cabin with practiced grace, stopping occasionally to check on passengers or offer a drink. It was the slight shift in demeanor when they passed by her. Maya knew that look. She had seen it too many times before. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was a hesitation there, a quiet uncertainty that hung in the air whenever she was near. The flight attendant who had questioned her earlier, the one who had hesitated before confirming her seat, had passed by a few more times since then. Each time, the woman's eyes would flicker toward Maya, and though she maintained her professional demeanor, there was a subtle edge to her movements. It wasn't aggressive, but it was noticeable. Maya felt her chest tighten. This was the discomfort she had come to know too well. The anxiety was familiar but no less unsettling. Maya had grown up with people questioning her place in spaces like this, spaces of power, privilege, and wealth. The world expected her to stay in the background, to remain in spaces deemed appropriate for someone like her. But that was never an option for Maya. She refused to conform to the boundaries others tried to place around her. Still, the weight of their judgment, quiet, invisible, often felt heavier than it should. Her thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice broke through the air, this time from the row just behind her. "Excuse me, miss?" Maya's heart skipped a beat at the unexpected interruption. She turned slowly in her seat to find a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, leaning toward her from the row behind. His dark brown eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, she felt the weight of his gaze as he studied her carefully, the intensity of his stare bordering on the invasive. Maya instinctively shifted in her seat, pulling herself back slightly, though her expression remained calm. "Yes," she responded, her voice steady. The man didn't seem to notice her discomfort. His smile was polite, but there was an air of curiosity about him that Maya couldn't quite place. "I couldn't help but notice," he began, his tone casual, You're in the front row. First class. I wasn't aware they were still offering upgrades. You must have gotten a pretty sweet deal." Maya's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. His words, though seemingly innocent, carried an undertone that made her uncomfortable. He had asked a question, but it felt more like an assumption, a question that didn't seem to be about her, but about her right to occupy the seat she had earned. Her grip on the armrest tightened for a brief moment, and she forced herself to remain composed. She knew how this conversation would go. She had been here before, had dealt with people who saw her as an anomaly rather than a person. She could feel his gaze now, assessing her every move, as if trying to calculate whether she belonged in the space she had claimed for herself. "I paid for the seat," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "I'm a paying customer just like anyone else." The man didn't seem to pick up on the edge in her voice, instead offering a wide grin. Of course," he said, nodding as though he had solved a puzzle. "I was just curious. You know, it's rare to see someone like you in this part of the plane." Maya's pulse quickened. "Someone like you." The phrase stung more than it should have. It wasn't the first time someone had implied that her presence in first class was an anomaly, a mistake. But it always hurt, every time. She had done everything right. She had worked tirelessly to build her career, to earn the right to sit here, to have a seat among those who thought they were entitled to everything the world had to offer. She could feel the tension rising in her chest. But she refused to let him see her flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, her gaze unwavering as she waited for him to move on. "Well, I guess you're an exception to the rule," the man continued, seemingly unaware of the discomfort he was causing. "I didn't mean to offend." Just a little surprised, I suppose. You know, most people like us, we don't see people like you in this kind of setting very often. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. She wanted to respond, wanted to correct him, wanted to tell him just how wrong he was. She wanted to remind him that she wasn't an exception. She wasn't a mistake. She wasn't some outlier in a world designed to keep people like her out of the rooms where important decisions were made. She had earned her place. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a controlled breath, looking away from him just enough to signal the end of the conversation. "I'm not an exception," she said quietly, her voice low but filled with conviction. "I'm the standard." She turned back toward her window, ending the conversation before he could respond. She didn't need to hear his thoughts on her worth. She had already proven that she belonged here. She didn't need anyone's approval. The man remained quiet for a long moment before he finally muttered a hasty apology and turned his attention to his own drink, leaving Maya alone in her thoughts. She could feel her heart still racing, the adrenaline of the encounter still pulsing through her veins, but she refused to let it affect her. She was stronger than this. She was more than this. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. She focused instead on the horizon, the soft glow of the morning sun casting light across the clouds. The world below seemed so small, so distant, as the plane glided through the sky. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had overcome to get here. She thought about her father's words, about the sacrifices she had made, about the fire that had driven her forward when everything around her tried to pull her back. Maya had never been content to sit on the sidelines. She wasn't here because she had been given anything. She was here because she had earned it, and she would fight to protect her place. No one, no matter how many looks they gave her, no matter how many words they spoke, would take that away from her. She settled into her seat once more, closing her eyes as the plane continued to climb higher, the clouds parting to reveal a vast sky of endless possibility. This was her moment, her journey, her story. And she would make sure the world would never forget it. The ripple of words. The air was thick with the unspoken tension that seemed to envelop the cabin in the moments after Maya's encounter with the man. Her heart had slowly settled, but her thoughts remained sharp, racing as they often did when she found herself battling assumptions she should never have to confront. The low murmur of conversations around her seemed distant, muted by the focus she now held on herself. She didn't need to look around to know that people were watching her, sizing her up, wondering if she belonged in this space. She could feel it, the subtle yet constant scrutiny of eyes that lingered just a bit too long, a bit too obviously. But she had learned long ago not to let that affect her. She was strong, and she was capable. She had earned every inch of the respect that came with her seat in first class. Her father had taught her how to hold her own, how to walk into any room with the confidence of someone who knew they had every right to be there. And yet, the sting of that conversation lingered in her chest, sharp and unrelenting. She was used to the microaggressions, the subtle remarks, the way people would try to diminish her achievements by reducing them to something as simple as her race. She glanced around again, this time taking in the faces of the other passengers. The man who had spoken to her was now preoccupied with his drink, his gaze directed downward as he fiddled with his phone. But there was a new presence on her radar, a young woman, barely 25, seated just across the aisle from her. Maya caught her staring. The young woman quickly looked away, but not before their eyes met for the briefest of moments. It wasn't the first time someone had stared at her like that, eyes wide, pupils flicking back and forth between curiosity and judgment. Maya could tell that the woman was trying to figure something out, trying to process what she had just seen. She didn't seem overtly hostile, but there was a certain hesitation in her glance that made Maya's stomach churn slightly. Maya let out a quiet breath, focusing once more on her tablet, though her mind was far from the proposals she had been reviewing earlier. Instead, she thought about the subtle ways the world had always made her feel like she had to prove herself, to assert her worth in spaces where she shouldn't have to. Why did it always fall to her to explain? To justify? To be better than what they expected her to be? She thought back to her father again. His words always rang in her ears, encouraging her to walk through life with pride, to stand tall, to never shrink in the face of ignorance. But even he couldn't shield her from the little stings, the way people sometimes looked at her, the way they questioned her presence, her success, her worth. It wasn't the big moments that made it hard. It was the quiet, everyday moments, the ones where no one said anything outright but the air felt thick with judgment. The looks. The assumptions. The way she had to keep her shoulders square and her chin high, day after day, just to make sure they didn't see her as weak. Her reverie was broken once more as a familiar face approached, another flight attendant, this one a tall woman with light blonde hair and an impeccable smile. Her approach seemed more measured, more deliberate than the last. Maya's stomach tightened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation earlier had somehow set things into motion, set the wheels turning in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant's voice was smooth, polite, but there was a slight tension in it, a hint of apprehension that Maya didn't miss. "I just wanted to confirm your meal preference for the flight." Maya blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that question, at least not phrased this way. The question itself wasn't out of place, of course. But there was something about the way it was asked, so formal, so rehearsed, that caught her attention. It was almost as if the woman was trying to keep things polite, trying to distance herself from something. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her seatbelt, tightening it slightly, though her expression remained neutral. She had grown used to the ways people tried to speak to her with a forced politeness, as if walking on eggshells. She didn't have time for it. "I already made my choice when I booked," she replied, her voice calm, but with a clear edge now. "The fish, please." The flight attendant's eyes darted toward the seating chart in her hand, her brow furrowing for just a second before she nodded. "Of course. I just wanted to be sure." She quickly moved on, not offering any further conversation. But Maya noticed how her footsteps faltered slightly, how she seemed to rush her movements, as if eager to leave the confrontation, eager to get back to something more familiar. Maya shook her head slightly, a strange sense of déjà vu creeping over her. The flight attendants weren't overtly hostile, but there was something unsettling in the way they interacted with her. Their actions were too polite, too careful. Like they didn't know how to treat her, didn't know whether they should show her respect or keep her at arm's length. The sense of unease that she felt earlier was beginning to take form, a creeping awareness that perhaps her status as a paying passenger wasn't the only thing that had earned her the seat she was in. No, it was the assumption of belonging that was still absent, the understanding that she could exist in this space without being questioned, without being doubted. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow, controlled breath. This was nothing new. She had fought her way to this place. She had broken down doors and dismantled barriers to be here. She wouldn't let anyone, no matter how subtle, take that away from her. But there was one thing she knew for certain, the unspoken rules of power, privilege, and perception were at work again, and they were not going to make her journey easy. The flight continued, and Maya did her best to ignore the mounting discomfort that simmered in the background. She pulled out her notebook once more, jotting down some thoughts for a new business idea that had been floating in her mind. Her fingers moved quickly over the pages, blocking out the quiet hum of the plane, the soft clink of silverware as meals were served, the sound of the air conditioning overhead. Her mind began to focus, slipping into the zone where she was most comfortable, planning, organizing, creating. She had learned long ago that the world might not always treat her fairly, but she could always find power in what she created, in what she could control. Her work was her own. Her legacy would be hers, built from the ground up, layer by layer, through persistence and grit. She would carve out a space for herself, no matter how many times the world tried to push her aside. But as the flight went on, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had felt it before, a ripple of unease that started with small things, insignificant details that grew over time into something bigger. Something was building. She couldn't quite put her finger on it yet, but she knew it would be more than just a few awkward interactions with flight attendants. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure if it would be a storm or a blessing. But whatever it was, she would face it head-on. She wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not ever.